So good old Millard Fillmore kind of has taken over for Zachary Tyler. And in the meantime, what's been happening during this whole period after the Mexican-American War through the election of 1848. And remember that the big thing with 1848 is about slavery expanding westward. And you have this real question about these market forces and this market economy. And so the election of 1848 had seen kind of the retrenchment, if you will, of kind of more dug in. Remember from the midterm. I know y'all are thinking, don't remind me of the midterm. But the retrenchment of this market economy. Well, as I mentioned before, the market economy can create some disruptions because there are people that struggle to make it in this kind of early capitalistic system, especially one where you don't have a government that has any kind of social programs in place. We don't have unemployment insurance. We don't have any kind of protections like that. In some ways, it was easier because people who kind of went bankrupt or belly up could kind of just pack up and move west and start over. And your creditors back in, Pennsylvania or wherever, they were just stuck, right? Because good luck coming to California to get money from you. So in that sense, they had it a little bit better. But in a different sense, it was worse because you were far more likely to have to give up everything if you got kind of ground under the wheels of a market economy, whether you're an artisan or a factory worker or, an independent farmer. So what will happen is that people keep moving westward. And so one of the other major factors in this western migration are the series of trails. And you should have talked about those in 8th grade, and I don't spend much time talking about things like the Oregon Trail and the California Trail, but you also have the Mormon Trail, which we'll be talking about this coming week. And so, whether it's the Mormons or just kind of people traveling to California and Oregon, the Donner Party is one of the famous stories of people that travel westward. If you've not ever heard about the Donner Party, remind me and I'll tell you about it. It's a great story of cannibalism and despair, I guess you could say. Make that sound too gleeful. Anyways, so the trails are a big part of western migration. And then we get to the California Gold Rush, okay? Here's where I knew somewhere in here I talked about Fremont's revolution. So John C. Fremont, he actually has one of those, accent symbols over the E that I don't mess with. Anyway, so he leads this revolution in 1846. Of course, this is about the time that the Mexican Revolution is going on and it's going to wind up and all that kind of stuff. So California, well, it kind of has a revolution, and I suppose if we were in California and studied California history instead of Texas history, I might have a little different angle on that. I know when we were in San Diego, we saw some stuff about this brief period of their independence. It's not nearly as dramatic and certainly not as long-lived as Texas. They don't have their Alamo moment, I guess you could say. And so, they're a unique group of people. I mean, this is true with anybody who's moving westward, right? If you're going to pack up everything and move west, it takes a level of independence that is really unheard of. I mean, this is what Crevecoeur was talking about when we read that in class, about what is an American. And that's where kind of that American spirit comes from. So we talk about it like it's just kind of an advertising slogan, but it's not. I mean, there's a real, to throw out your $10 word for the day, your real zeitgeist, if you will. Schadenfreude, I think, is another word for it, like this whole kind of mindset about who we are. And they kind of take this courage, this willing to take on challenges, this belief in themselves, this belief in hope and a better future and all this kind of stuff that is really kind of balled up into this American identity. And these people are living it, right? Nowadays, in the 21st century, we see it most often with, say, entrepreneurs. They're the ones that are typically embodying that spirit. And there's definitely some truth to that. So if you're thinking in terms of de Tocqueville's 5 values, what you're looking at in a lot of ways is going to be, how do people wrestle with in a laissez-faire economy that clearly the 1840s and 1850s is all about laissez-faire. So we have this laissez-faire economy that unfortunately, people can get hurt in. You can lose everything. So people's individualism is defined by the ability to pack up and move west, right? And so this is kind of like the pinnacle of American individualism. And the pinnacle probably of American laissez-faire. Now, obviously, American equality is probably lying real low on the list here, and things like liberty that's going to factor in big with Western migration, and populism is going to be big if you're talking about the East Coast. Now, the people moving out west, they have bigger concerns. They're worried about, finding food and shelter, unless you're the Donner Party, in which case they're all in the same place. But anyways, so yeah, Ryan's over here rolling his eyes probably. Anyways, so you get to 1848 in California, you have the discovery of gold, and this is going to attract a lot of people that have been struggling in the market economy. This is where the gold, the 49ers come from. You get a lot of people coming in. There's an interesting, one of the books that we used to read in my class, The 10 Days That Changed America. One of the chapters in that book talks about 1849 and what a profound difference the gold mine made to California, because it brings so many more Americans in. And keep in mind that Americans have been coming to California for probably 10 years, but the 49ers that are coming in are a whole different group. Lots of young men, again, at this boom economy. And what's interesting about the boom economy is that a lot of this is secondary products, things like pickaxes and clothing and tents and, pans to sift through the gold and all this kind of stuff. So that really becomes the boom economy, as opposed to the gold. It doesn't take very long before the gold that's really easy to get to, that's very close to the surface, before that's depleted. And before long, all these independent miners get pushed into mining companies and mining partnerships, and you end up seeing the same thing happen with the mining business that we've seen happen in many other things, which is that the individual that creates the successful enterprise is then replaced by a partnership, which is then replaced by a company, and that company then hires workers that are then paid minimal wages. One of the interesting things that we see with California too is the Chinese. China during this period, and without going too much into world history, although I think it's important, especially given the 21st century importance of China, I think it's important to understand the background there. So China, we talked about this way back at the start of the year, that China was where all the good stuff was, right? And that's where Europe was going. And China made an intentional decision not to continue exploration. They were actually ahead of Europeans in exploring, and they basically put a stop to it and said, oh, we don't need to. We have all the good stuff. And so Europe starts showing up to get tea and to get silks and that kind of thing. And before long, Britain decides, oh my goodness, well, we have a trade deficit with China and we don't like that. And they find a way to get the opium plant, which is in, say, Turkey, northern India, and they start taking that into China and develop really what is a systematic addiction in the cities that the British trade in. And this is going to create, it's going to change that trade deficit. So Britain essentially engages in legalized drug dealing in order to gain a foothold in China. Now, I tell you all this because in the meantime, while this is happening, especially in these port cities in China, the Chinese dynasty is going through kind of some bad times, right? There's lots of tension and chaos. It's very dysfunctional, lots of corruption. They've got the whole Chinese bureaucracy that's emerging that goes back to, say, Confucius and that kind of thing. So you've got these problems going on in China. You've got massive population explosion. We're having kind of the same disruptions with this kind of baby global system that farmers in China are struggling. So what's going to happen is there's not enough jobs. There's poverty. There's famine. And so people say, you know what, let's go find something else. And so you get a lot of Chinese, especially Chinese males, that come to California because it's certainly a lot easier to get across the ocean in 1848 to get a job in California working in a gold mine than it is to, say, cross China and Mongolia in order to get to Europe. So that's what we're going to see happening. Well, one of the issues with the Chinese immigrants, first off, that we've seen that there were some issues with the Irish coming in, and so there's kind of this feeling that the Irish are different and that kind of thing. And clearly, if you are fresh off the boat from Ireland, you're going to have a brogue and you're not going to act quite the same. But it won't take very long before you're able to kind of drop some of that, right? And sound like an American or very close to like an American. For the Chinese, that's very different, right? I mean, they physically, their face, their hair, their physical appearance is clearly different from your Anglo-Europeans, right? And so that's going to create a real burden. In addition, the Chinese have a much stronger cultural difference, right? Chinese culture is pretty well developed. It's far older than anything that's kind of English or Anglo or whatever. And so they don't feel the need to abandon their cultural trademarks. So that's going to be another factor. So there's going to be a lot of anti-immigration bias against the Chinese. And that's going to be very important, especially when we get after the Civil War. And so it's kind of interesting to point out that this is where the American relationship with China really begins, is with this idea of the influx of Chinese miners. They will also then be very important in building the railroad, the Pacific Railroad coming from California to the east. They will do a lot of that dangerous work. So Chinese immigration is incredibly important. They were known by most business owners as being incredibly good workers. And in fact, this is going to be one of the things that leads to anti-immigrant bias, is you're going to have, white Americans that say, oh, they're taking all the jobs. Well, they were, because they are not all the jobs, but they're taking some of the jobs, particularly jobs in mining and the railroad, because they're willing to work and they're willing to accept the wages that the business owners want to pay. And of course, some of these Chinese end up going back to China. Some stay here. That's why California has kind of this Chinese community that goes back, to the 1800s. So it's kind of an interesting insight into where the United States begins its relationship with China. And then to also understand that we really kind of we kind of miss the boat when it comes to China, because we're so convinced, thanks to this manifest destiny, Anglo-American superiority, we're so convinced that we're better that we never really have a dialogue with China. Now, when it's the Chinese dynasty, that doesn't matter so much. But when we get to talking about the 1880s and 1890s, we'll talk about how the U.S. refused to have any kind of real relationship with China, and how that ultimately is going to lead to the Communist Revolution, and that will lead to the Korean War, and then that will lead to the Vietnam War, and then that leads to the situation we have with China now. So yes, the situation with China now goes back to the California Gold Rush. And I'm making kind of a loose interpretation, but you can see there's some threads there. So I just wanted to be sure and point that out to you. So you need to be sure you remember that the gold rush, the Chinese immigration that's going on here, as well as kind of the impact of, say, the de Tocqueville's 5 values, with the individualism and the liberty being driving factors for people moving out west. So let's kind of recap where we are as far as states are concerned, because we're about to get into the Compromise of 1850. So we purchased the Louisiana Purchase. We got 5 new states. We come up with this whole balance in Congress thing, right? You get to the Missouri Compromise. Missouri wants to be a slave state. What do? Henry Clay says, I know, we'll create Maine. Missouri's a slave state, and then we'll draw this imaginary line, and then that everybody, to the north of that doesn't have slavery. Everyone to the south of that does. Well, then you get to California. And this 3630 line runs right through the middle of California. So you're either creating two states out of California, or you got to make California one or the other. Well, Tyler, and I just put Taylor all over this thing, didn't I? Tyler is going to say that he wants California to be a free state, and I think I touched on this before, right? And he's willing to go down there and kick some butt to make that happen. And so when he dies, right, we're still wrestling with this question of California. And the people that are left in charge are going to be men like Millard Fillmore and Henry Clay, who by this point is getting extremely old. And so he's going to basically come up with this notion of the Compromise of 1850. And so what will happen, and the Stephen Douglas, right, he's going to be another guy that we'll know for having bad ideas. So Tyler basically kind of said, hey, I'm not going to let that happen. We're having disputes between Texas and New Mexico over, where that boundary is. In fact, I don't know if you remember Mirabeau B. Lamar from Texas history. He's kind of one of those guys that was into all of that. And so you're having this debate about how big Texas is really, how big is New Mexico. So we're just having lots of kind of tensions over this western expansion. So again, remember, we wanted all this territory. We wanted to have all these options, and now we've got it, except now it's just creating a bunch of problems, right? So what will happen is that Henry Clay, and like I said, Stephen Douglas will kind of be his, I don't know if he literally was a protege, but he certainly philosophically was his protege, is going to come up with this idea of the Compromise of 1850. And you can see all the details here. The big thing that I think is pretty interesting is that you really kind of have a compromise that doesn't make anybody happy, right? A compromise that's really pretty distasteful to all. So it's a compromise in that it's just terrible. New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, there's not a lot of debate about that. First off, this is before air conditioning, so who really wants to go to Arizona and New Mexico? I mean, not a lot of people. Utah, of course, is settled by Mormons, and so slavery is not an issue there. And so that's kind of an easy, that doesn't offend anybody. Texas, gets this great deal to pay off their debt. The real issue here, the real key part of this, is going to be this issue with the slave trade in D.C. and the Fugitive Slave Act. So the Texas deal, the territories, those are kind of, everyone's like, okay, whatever. Nobody thinks that's a big deal. But then when you get to the slave trade in D.C., that's seen as a gift to people that are abolitionists, right? Now, it doesn't abolish slavery in D.C. So when we get to secession, D.C. has slaves, right? But it does abolish the slave trade, and which is part of why when Northup, of course, is in D.C., there's a slave market there, right? Because that was okay back then. Then you're going to get to the Fugitive Slave Act, and this is the big concession to Southerners about not forcing this issue on California. And that's going to be that citizens now have to assist in capturing fugitives or be fined. So if it's proven that I know that this person living at the other end of town is a runaway slave, if I know that and I don't turn that person in and it comes to light that I knew that, I can be fined, right? I can get in trouble. Not for doing anything. It's not like I helped the person escape. It's not like I'm harboring them. But I just know, or I suspect, that they're an escaped slave, and I don't bother to tell anyone. And if that comes out, then I get in trouble. So this is going to make citizens pretty unhappy, especially citizens in places like Boston that have a pretty active abolitionist society. They're going to find this pretty ridiculous. Then you're going to see that we don't really have a jury trial. So in other words, if you are, accused of being a fugitive slave, you don't go before a jury, right, where you have people that stand up for you and all this kind of stuff. The city has a special commission created. And if you notice, I put it down right here, that they actually tend to make more money if they return the slave back to their owner as opposed to setting them free. So huge problem there, right? And then, of course, it just makes it easier. They have more officials in place. So the Compromise of 1850 is really no compromise if you are an abolitionist or if you are even somewhat anti-slavery. You're going to look at the Compromise of 1850 and really find it to be an insult. They're basically forcing Americans that don't like slavery to either break the law to follow their conscience or to not follow their conscience, right? So again, if you think in terms of de Tocqueville's values, I mean, where is individualism in this process? Where can we begin to follow our individual conscience? Where's my liberty if I'm an abolitionist and I don't want to support recapturing somebody that I know is a runaway slave? This is one of the reasons Frederick Douglass has to go to England, because of the Compromise of 1850. This becomes a money-making enterprise, right? A slave owner down in Louisiana or Georgia or wherever can say, yeah, I've got a runaway slave and he or she looks like this. And they send people, and these are actual federal officials, to go look for them in New York, in Boston, in Maine. And they go looking for them. Well, do you think they're going to be super picky about whether you exactly fit that description? It creates a real sense of fear for many, many people and for many, many Americans. Causes a massive flight into Canada. And again, you have more captures, more kidnapping, that kind of thing. And if you were a freed black or a black who had escaped and you were very vocal about having been so or about the conditions of slavery, you would be significantly targeted by these people coming up north and by the things that they were trying to, but by them kidnapping you. And this is where the Underground Railroad is going to become very important, because their whole idea is going to be, we have to operate underground. We have to get people out of the South. And it's not enough just to get them up north. We have to get them to Canada. So the Underground Railroad is going to get very important. And again, for if somebody was kind of, hey, I don't like slavery. I mean, I'd rather not make a decision about it. So I'm just going to kind of like not think anything about it. And I'm just going to, I'm pro-market economy. You go market. And, let's just maintain a balance with the territories. What do we have to fight over slavery? Well, now the Compromise of 1850 is going to hit, and you're put in a position where it's kind of hard to be neutral. Because if you are neutral and it gets caught that you knew about something or you might have known about something, you're going to get fined. And so this creates a huge problem, right? And so it does really kind of, again, for all that it's called a compromise, the Compromise of 1850 is going to be the next step towards ultimately the Civil War. I mean, it starts with the Wilmot Proviso, where we see this idea that slavery, or that compromise shouldn't really exist. Then you get to the Compromise of 1850, and many abolitionist and anti-slavery people are going to look at the Compromise of 1850 and see it very much the same way that pro-slavery people saw the Wilmot Proviso. Which is, this is not, what I signed up for. This is not what my idea of a compromise is. And it's going to ultimately widen that crack a little bit. Now, it seems to kind of hold things together. You do have us resolving some of these territorial tensions thanks to the Mexican-American War. And, a big part of this is the death of Tyler. Tyler's going to be the one who probably could have, strong-armed people into just accepting California as a free state and liking it. And when he dies, there's really no good way around it. And what will happen is that Fillmore, who's clearly, he's a Whig and he supports the compromise. But because he supports the compromise, because Henry Clay supported the compromise, this Whig party is going to fall apart. We've already seen that the Democrats are fracturing over the slavery issue. In fact, you're going to end up with the northern wing of the Democratic Party and a southern wing of the Democratic Party. Now we're going to see that the Whig Party begins to do this as well. And again, it's over slavery. And the other big thing is kind of this lack of leadership. You really see this happening going back. I mean, Jackson's your last really strong president, and we can argue about him being a good or bad strong president, but he's definitely a strong president. And then you have this period of, 30 years almost, before you have Abraham Lincoln, who's able to come in and again be a strong president. So, I mean, I think that's another piece of the puzzle, is that you have this whole process that kind of begins going back to kind of this, Texas and independence and kind of this Western migration with people going for the cotton market and all that kind of thing. And remember, one of the reasons people were attracted into Texas was the Compromise of 1820 that did not allow slavery to go any farther north. So that's going to pull Southerners into Texas. That's going to create an independent Texas. Then that's going to create the Mexican-American War. Then we have the territorial tensions because we have all this land. And then we get to the Compromise of 1850, which, like I said, if you weigh that with the Wilmot Proviso, you can definitely see where the sides are starting to draw lines. Where pro-slavery people are suggesting that we should be able to enforce our slavery viewpoints anywhere, and anti-slavery people suggesting that we should be able to support our anti-slavery viewpoints anywhere. And again, this is you're talking about people's right to property. You're talking about people's right to self-determination. Those concepts of individualism and liberty. You've got concepts about equality. And kind of the role of the economy in all of this, and what is the role of the government. You see the impact of populism, of people forming political groups based on strongly held beliefs. And so this era right here is full of these conflicts and full of these tensions between these five values, and how they just, because of the rapid growth and rapid changes, are really pulling and stretching and falling apart. So I think, if I remember correctly, I'm going to stop here because I'm coming up at about 20 minutes, and this next section is going to be pretty meaty, and so I want to be sure that I can do it all in one session. So then that will be, I think, that'll be the fourth one, something like that, maybe the fifth.